Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar. It's a very special webinar, as I think I mentioned last time, that we're very, very pleased to be joined by Deryn Griffiths from Australia. I have spoken to her. It's very exciting that all the technology seems to be working so far, so cross fingers that it holds up throughout tonight's session. Just a few housekeeping announcements. It's only going to be the microphones and video on our computers that are going to be operating tonight. So that's myself and Deryn's computer. So please do feel free to get up, make yourself comfortable and move around without fearing that you're disturbing anyone. In a slight change to normal, we're going to be taking questions throughout the webinar tonight. So if you're on Zoom, please do use the Q&A interface to enter your question, and we'll answer them when we get to an appropriate breakpoint in the presentation. So especially if you'd like to pause and talk about something that's being spoken about, please do enter a question. Of course, we'll wrap up with questions at the end, so if you do miss your moment of opportunity, please do push it in. If you're watching on YouTube, you're very welcome, but I'm afraid there is no facility for interaction from there. Deryn's talk is expected to be between 30 or 40 minutes, excluding questions. Yeah, all that remains is for me to welcome Deryn, so I will ask her to join us on the screen. And whilst that's happening, I'll just mention that Deryn learnt to ring in Sydney in 1990, and she's lived there, Adelaide and Melbourne. And she's currently the webmaster for the Australian and New Zealand Association of Bell Ringers, and has rung at 61 of the 64 towers in Australia and several towers in England, Scotland, some in Wales, some in South Africa, and some in Canada. Well, I think that's yeah, I've rung at some towers in Wales, but not very many. So that's a similarity there. Good evening. Good morning indeed. Thank you very, very much for joining us very early in your morning.
Thank you, David. And I should have mentioned New Zealand, of course. I've rung at most of the towers in New Zealand as well. It's our closest neighbour and part of our association, Australian and New Zealand Association.
Wonderful. Well, I'll just hand over to you then.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me, everyone who's here to listen. Sorry, just do this share screen thing and I'll be with you. Okay, there we are.
Perfect.
Interrupt me if anything's not working or people want me to dwell on anything, as you said. So I've been asked to talk about ringing in Australia, and we have two webmasters. Simon McMillan has been webmaster for over 10 years, and I've just joined him recently, and there's certainly enough work for two of us. So I'll just start with an acknowledgement of country. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I speak today and pay my respects to elders past and present, and explain to you, most of whom will be not so familiar with Australia, though I imagine many of you have visited, that Australian history is divided basically from 1788. Before 1788, well, the people that lived here and continue to live here had been here for about 30,000 years, but in 1788 we had colonisation by the British, of which I'm part, obviously, more and more being recognised as an invasion, rather than just a colonisation of an uninhabited country. I won't dwell any more on that, not being the subject of the talk, and not being my area of expertise either. Let's talk about the population density of Australia, just as a bit of a background. So the lightest two shades there, we're talking less than 1 person per square kilometre. And only the very darkest shade is 100 people per square kilometre or more. So it's a large bit of Australia which has a very, very sparse population. And the tourist view of Australia, a lot of people come for the tourist, not just the bell ringing, unsurprisingly. a lot about our animals, our countryside, our scenery, culture, tiny bit of skiing in season, not much. So that's a good reason in itself to come to Australia when you're allowed to come again. The tourist gotcha, Australia really is a very large country. So that's showing you a few, well, it's showing you Great Britain on top of part of Australia, just to remind you about the distances we're dealing with. And this may be the only map that actually shows the main cities. So Perth there on the southwest, Adelaide in the middle south, Melbourne, Hobart over in the east, and then going up the east coast, Canberra, Sydney, Brisbane. Darwin is the other capital city right up in the north, but at the moment still no bells there. No bells in the whole of the Northern Territory. But there's some discussions going on to get some bells in Darwin. So the key themes for my talk, I thought I'd focus on what I think are the differences between ringing in the UK and ringing in Australia, and the distances, the differences are the distances that we're dealing with here. Very different to what you're dealing with. The climate, that might be the most dramatic thing or more fun thing to talk about, and the ringing history, because if you think of the ringing in the UK, the ringing history goes back before colonisation of Australia by the British, and there's been I'll talk about that. I think that the newness of it, and I'm not just talking 200 years, I'm talking the last 50 years, makes quite a difference to the ringing scene here. So this is the bell ringers view of Australia. That map comes from Dove. So that's the towers in Australia. You can see where they're concentrated along with the main concentration of population. But if you're a visitor, your Bible is the website, of which I'm one of the webmasters, and you go to our tower directory. It's under one of those top menus, towers and rings, and it lists all the towers and the contact details and when they ring and special notes like this particular one. In Perth, practice is followed by a monthly meal on the third Wednesday of the month. So that's, encourage people to come along and have the sociable side as well as the bell ringing side. So what I'm planning to do, that little black arrow is a little bit of a tour of the talk. I'm just going to not cover every tower, not even cover every state, but go through Perth, Adelaide, and then some of the eastern state towers, and see how far we get. So I'll start with Perth. So Perth and its surrounds, we blow that up. We've got 8 towers. They're not all in Perth. They're all within 3 hours drive of each other. So we count that as one little cluster. I think 6 of them have quite active bands, and the 2 more remote ones, one of which is very new and one of which is not quite so new, are not ringing regularly, but the bells are available and the ringers do go there and make use of them and try and encourage the locals and teach the locals. There's 116 in Perth, the bell tower, previously known as Swan Bells, but got so well known as a local icon, and if all the local non-bell ringers called it the bell tower, so it got renamed. Mostly light 8s. So St George's Cathedral's the old one. It was had bells put in 1902. All of the others have been installed since 1985. So in the last 35 years, it went from being 1 tower to being 8 towers. We've got 2 of them are civic, the bell tower, and one other that's a civic tower, 6 churches. It's a very active society. It's very sociable. It's very hospitable. I've been there to work. I think I had 6 weeks work in Perth. I just got taken under their wing, picked up, taken to handbell sessions, taken traveling to the other towers to go and help teach. It's got the sort of situation you go and ring for St George's Sunday morning service, and then the bell tower is a 5-minute walk down the road. They're they say, oh, does anyone want a quarter peal? Oh, well, the bells are available. They're almost always available at the bell tower, as long as there's no function going on. And just organising quarter peals on the spot, getting picked up, taking off to other towers to ring quarter peals with interesting methods and callings, and very lively. Very sociable with each other. It's not one band. There's some distinct bands at the different towers, but they do get together, have a very coherent, sociable side. Their newsletter includes news from people who have been in Perth but are now back in the UK, and they still keep in touch. It's quite self-contained. It's 3 hours flying to the nearest other tower, which would be Adelaide. It's 3 hours time difference from me at the moment, so it's still an hour before sunrise here, 6:30 in the morning, and it's 3:30 in Perth at the moment. I do notice a difference in that time zone and just how long it takes to get there. So they're self-contained in that I'd say I'm not talking about any individuals there, but just as a group, it's not like they mostly ring in the Perth area rather than go travelling to other towers outside the Perth area. Perth can be quite hot. I think today it's forecast to be 38 degrees. At the moment, 3:30 in the morning, it's about 18 degrees, so it's cooled down nicely overnight, but it's going to be a hot day for them. I'll talk more about the heat in Adelaide, where I've actually lived for 5 years. So any questions at this stage, or I'll move on?
Well, I think thank you very much for that introduction. What we're going to do is let's see if we can do that. There we go. Right. Yeah, so we've had a couple of comments. They're more observations than anything else so far. And that's just to say, well, Australia is very big, very good observation so far. And that it's also been noted that the bell tower in Perth might stand a chance of being the best 16 anywhere in the world, possibly to the point that we might even try and get a specific talk about that later. But yeah, if you had any comment on how they ring as a 16, that might be interesting.
Yeah, it's certainly a pleasure to ring there, and it's a pleasure just to go, and because the bells are all behind in glass, you can go up, take a lift up, or climb the stairs. It's air conditioned, and just sit and watch the bells. So as you hear the patterns, you can see the patterns with the bells turning over. And my parents, who have visited quite a few bell towers in their time, even though they're not ringers, one time I was in Perth with them, and they were going to go off to the Botanic Gardens, and I was going to go off bell ringing. I said, come along, just to have a look at it. It's a bit different and special. Oh, well, we'll come just for 20 minutes. We really want to go to the Botanic Gardens. Well, an hour and a half later, they're just mesmerised watching the bells. It's a very, good outreach in that people can come and see the bells. I don't think they get to ring on 16 a lot. I think they'll use the 10 or 12. I think more when they have visitors, they're more likely to actually be able to ring the 16. I have rung on 16 there. I've rung on 18 just because they put in the 2 accidentals just so they can say they've done it. But 16, maybe trying something, Plain Hunter or Little Bob, something like that. It's quite a challenge, obviously. From my feeling, the nicest thing about ringing on 16 is that it makes 12 seem easy. It's like that step back. It's like, oh, maybe I can hear 12 after all, because 16 is whoa, brrr. But yeah, it's fun, and it is good to have a 16. I mean, then until they put that in, they only had 8 bell towers in that side of the country, so it's a great facility.
And just out of interest, do they do anything to identify bells at St Martin in the Bullring?
Where different colour sallies.
Yeah, every fourth is different.
Yeah, I've forgotten exactly what they do. You'll have to get one of those ringers there to talk to you. Yeah,
no problem. And then the next question is obviously really unusual to have a group of towers where they're mostly what we describe as new bells. So yeah, obviously if we came across an area here where there were sort of 7 out of 8 towers installed since 1985, we'd probably regard that as quite a new area.
That's why I say our history is different to yours. That's
Indeed.
quite remarkable.
And what would you say has been the main driver for the installation? Is it sort of has it been sort of group efforts, or has it been predominantly individual efforts, would you say?
I don't know the full history, but I do know that Laith Reynolds and other Reynolds, Laith Reynolds may be even known to you. Laith and Andrew work for Taylors, but are based here, have been a big driver behind it and very good at getting support, financial and government support. So the 16 were, I think 11 or 12 of them were donated from St Martin's in the Field, but I think they helped facilitate and prompt and encourage that would be an appropriate gift to the city of Perth. So yes, there is a particular person that has helped drive that a lot. And I think that, I mean, there were a lot of very good locally trained ringers dating back probably to 1902, but certainly well before 1985. I was taught by someone who learnt to ring in Perth. But especially with the 16, the bell tower coming on, other bell ringers who'd learnt in the UK but were living in Perth came out of the woodwork. So I'd say we have quite a large proportion of, well, a significant proportion of ringers in Australia who learnt to ring in the UK, and that's fantastic for us because they come and help strengthen our bands here. And then we have people like me who've got very strong UK roots. I moved from England to Australia at the age of 4. So I sort of still got that cultural tie to England in some way, but I learnt here. And then others who Australian for generations or have come from other countries to Australia who've learnt locally as well. So it's quite a mix in that way.
Great, thanks. And then just sort of final note on this one, Tom Ridgman notes that ringing Stedman on the front 5 in Perth was difficult.
I don't know which front 5 we're talking, maybe on the 16 on the bell tower.
Yeah, oh, there you are.
Okay, well, good on him.
And so, so should we move on to Adelaide?
Yes, so then the other thing I thought I should tell you about Perth is if you travel north, 5 hours flight gets you to Singapore, which is actually closer time zone than traveling east. And we've actually got new bells in Singapore, so that's quite exciting. But let's travel east onto Adelaide, 3 hours flight. And here's Adelaide. It looks like one dot on the bigger map, but actually there's 5 towers in there, and they're all within 15 minutes drive of each other. There were 2 towers up until 1946, and then we added St Peter's Cathedral, which is probably the most, I mean, the 16 is very special, but the 8 bell tower with a 4,100 weight tenor is also very special. Taylor's bells from 1947. People come and say, oh, vintage Taylors, they sound fantastic. But anything of that weight for an 8 is going to be hard work to ring. But they ring well for their weight. But I prefer to stay around the front 4 or 5 if I can, personally. St Peter's Cathedral is known as the cathedral end of the cricket ground. So if you're listening to or watching the cricket, you hear the bells at St Peter's Cathedral, and we quite like that. We enjoy it. I lived in Adelaide for 5 years, so I sort of feel a bit of belonging there. We enjoy it. We sometimes get notes from English ringers that they heard us. We think of, if the cricket's on and we get to ring, that sort of feels a bit of extra special. While I was there, I managed to ring for the funeral for Don Bradman, very famous Australian cricketer. The 12 bell tower went in 1996. So again, very new as far as being able to ring on more than 8 bells. It's pretty recent in the history of Adelaide. It's essentially one band. Those 5 towers being within 15 minutes drive. One of them is a town hall. That's one of the old ones. And it's the most difficult tower to, or the bells as far as being the most difficult to ring. And there are hopes to get that refurbished to make it a bit easier to ring. They're certainly ringable, but just within the standard of Adelaide. I think all the others are very nicely hung. It's one band on a Sunday morning that start at the 6 bell tower and half an hour there and move on to the one to the west in Prospect, and then to St. Peter's Cathedral, and then to St. Francis Xavier, the 12. And I think all the services conveniently start half an hour after each other. And, you know, not everyone does all towers, obviously, but there's quite a coherent feel to that band. It's very inclusive. When I rang there, maybe partly because they can't afford to be anything else. If you've got one band, all your towers so close, you can't really afford to be cliquey. You don't have so many ringers that you can be snobby about who you're ringing with. And, you know, where in other places, well, in Sydney, I'm not in the top 10 or 12 ringers. When I was in Adelaide, I was, so I'd get invited into things, and that then improved my bell ringing because I got to do so much. But it's not just because I was in the top 10 that I would get invited into things. It was just because they're a very inclusive band. We used to have striking competitions where we'd stack the bands to try and even them up so that everyone, you know, everyone's encouraged to. It was more of a participation thing rather than a competition. Those ringers there who take a long time to progress, and they're still very much part of the band, and a lot of them progress really well and end up being tower captains. So it's a real strength that they have. I'm not saying other places don't, but I lived there and I saw that, and it's just one of the things I remember it for. I'm not sure right at the moment, but they still have, it may be like that now, they still have a lot of very good ringers, but being such a small band, it can be really marginal. And at 1 year it might be Splice Surprise Major, 1 or 2 people leave, and suddenly, especially on the heavy bells, maybe we're struggling to do rounds and call changes on front 6 for service ringing in the next year. Adelaide can be really hot, and it's very dry heat. So this is what I'd call furnace heat. I think of it as, especially if you're going into the area or you've been in air conditioning and you step outside, like opening the door of a furnace. It just blasts you. Gradually over the years, we've added air conditioning, and I think three of the 5 towers have air conditioning at the moment. I think that's it. That's quite interesting in itself. So the 12 bell tower, it was quite new. I moved to Adelaide in 1996 when it was brand new. And for some reason, people put air conditioning in there, possibly not having talked to bell ringers, or possibly we just didn't understand. So they put in evaporative air conditioning rather than refrigerative air conditioning. Evaporative air conditioning increases the humidity. And there was one sad day when we left it on by mistake, and we came back a few days later and the ropes were very, very stiff and very unpleasant ringing. I think that has changed now. The air conditioning helps, but even so, hot means 40 degrees plus sometimes, and sometimes for several days in a row. Not typically, but most summers you'll get days like that, and quite a few of the towers would have a hot weather policy. If it was forecast to be 38 or 40 degree maximum temperature, assume practice is cancelled. We'd usually still ring for services which are in the morning, or, you know, if it's a wedding, you sort of do your best, but you might not ring for practice. St Andrews, the picture on the left is bells for St Andrews. That's the 6-bell tower, one of the old ones. So the Town Hall and St Andrews, the 6-bell tower, were the oldest towers, and they were very recently rehung in the last year. It's so it's a lovely picture from the priest blessing them before they've been put up in the tower. So I haven't rung on them since they've been rehung. It's not been possible to. So with ringing in this heat, it's like this furnace heat. Well, what do? You have air conditioning now. Not always. You have a lot of fans, even if you've got air conditioning, and you try and position the fans especially towards the ringers of the heavier bells, because yes, that is harder work. You take a lot of water, you drink a lot of water, obviously not in the middle of a quarter peal or a peal, but you do what you can. You put your water bottle in the freezer the night before so that you can take it along as a bottle of ice and it will melt and you've got cold water. You fill up your water bottle halfway and then in the morning fill it up with water so that you've actually got some water immediately, plus your second ice bottle for later in the day. If you're ringing a peal, you might choose your time of day a little bit, but people push through and do an amazing amount. You're ringing in the heat, the sweat is dripping down your face, and you hope your eyebrows are big enough that it sort of redirects the sweat and it's not actually in your eyes, stinging your eyes, down your body, dribbling down your legs. It's really hot. But you're keen ringers, you do it anyway, and it's good fun, but you do want to go and have a cold shower afterwards. Don't think there's anything else I had in mind to say. 7 hours drive to your nearest tower, and that's a country tower in Victoria, further to what I'd call a major centre. So again, quite isolated, this group of 5 from towers around it. People here, I'd say, maybe a little bit more likely to travel than the Perth ringers. It's not quite so far. I mean, it's only a 1-hour flight to Melbourne or Sydney. That's a lot more manageable than a 3-hour flight if you're thinking about a weekend trip. It's from the eastern states to New Zealand is closer than the eastern states to Perth. So this is a little bit more integrated with the eastern states, but still quite self-contained in a lot of ways. Okay, any questions at this point, or I'll move on?
I can't see any questions, but what I was going to say was I think I've done my scan around the towers there, right? And is it correct there are 2 practices a week normally, roughly, in Adelaide?
Yes, I think that there's Prospect and St Peter's Cathedral. When I was living there were 3 practices a week, because there was a practice at the 12-bell tower, but that goes up and down depending on number of ringers and enthusiasm and what have you. So as I said, it's quite a one band. So you go to whichever practice you can make, but then you can ring at all the towers, obviously. So yeah, when I was there, it was 3, and I think at the moment 2.
Yeah,
which is a bit of a pity. It would be nice to have a practice at the 12-bell tower, a regular practice.
Yeah. And so and I suppose that's the question. Would you expect sort of other engagements aside, most people to attend both, or again, this is not just not
no people. There would be a core enthusiastic group that would ring at both practices, but if you can make 1 practice a week, you're doing well. So it wouldn't be that everyone would attend all the practices. When I moved to Adelaide, it was coincident with me starting a shift working job as a weather forecaster, and I had a few hobbies before that, but bell ringing, having already learnt to ring, bell ringing was fantastic for shift worker. I could just 3 practices a week, I'd go to whichever 1 or 2 or 3 fitted in with my roster, and it wasn't going to be the same ones every week because it was a rotating roster. And they were fantastic about that. It's just whatever you can manage, you come and you're part of it. And I really learned, we had different tower captains at each tower, and I learned different things. So I had St Peter's Cathedral, Ian Harris, now in Perth, was the tower captain, very good ringer and very focused on good striking, and especially given the heavy bells, good rhythm, good handling, good striking was a really good thing to be focused on at St Peter's Cathedral. And then I'd go to the 12-bell tower, and at that time, Phil Goodyear was tower captain, now back in Adelaide after quite a number of years in London. He learnt in Sydney, and there I'd get, and then at Prospect I'd get more pushed on, and Walkerville I'd get more pushed on doing some conducting. So it was fantastic for me that each tower had its own character, and I learnt different things from each one.
That's
I learnt
great.
a bit of bell maintenance as well while I was in Adelaide.
That's good. And just to go back to the comments about ringing Steadman on the front five, what Tom's saying is that the front five in the 16th,
very flat.
Yeah, it's very flat. So if you're just ringing those five, you end up trying to look down this long line. So, anyway, but I think that's it on questions for Adelaide.
Move on to the eastern states.
Cool.
We're all into one slide. So here we've got, counting Melbourne and Victoria, and I've put Albury, which is just over the border. We've got 11 towers within 4 hours drive of each tower, 5 towers in Melbourne. And the Melbourne towers, I said Adelaide, one of them was challenging, and 4 of them, well, I mean, they have their challenges, but I'd say they're really well hung. In Melbourne, I'd say 3 of them are challenging. So it just sort of reduces it. Well, it adds different complexities to it. In Ballarat, which is an hour's drive, or just over an hour to the west of Melbourne, 2 in Ballarat put in the 1800s, which I think is pretty remarkable. At the moment, it feels like it's a small country town. That's a picture of Ballarat Town Hall down on the lower right. But it was a big gold mining town, and it was a very wealthy area. So I think the town hall went in first, but anyway, there's a town hall and one church, both got bells, and they both still ring, and they're both, it was quite a common weekend day outing from Melbourne, go up and, I mean now it still is, well it was up to a year ago, go and ring in Ballarat for a Sunday afternoon, and then the Ballarat ringers put on afternoon tea for us, and it's all very pleasant and fun. So talking points, handling and tuning. So the towers in Melbourne, we've got one tower, which I'd say the handling is so challenging that when I see ringers ring there, some of the locals, although, well, they ring better, I say locals, it's their home tower, I go there and I feel like a beginner because the bells are so challenging to ring. The tower's got a lot of sway to it. We've got another tower which anti-clockwise ring. Anyone who's been to Melbourne knows what I'm talking about, but rounds is so out of tune that I can't hear it. And if anyone's, then you've realised that you do listen to the bells quite a bit. And then we've got a very light 6 where people almost grazing their knuckles on the ceiling, so I count that as fairly tricky as well. So that's when I say challenging, that's the 3 that I'm thinking of as challenging. When I'm actually putting dates on the towers here, up until 1985, this was the only 12-bell tower in the whole of Australia. Not this picture, St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne was the only 12-bell tower in the whole of Australia. So any 12-bell ringing in Australia was done in Melbourne. And I forget exactly when, 1950s, 1960s, it was probably the centre of ringing. There was some very good ringing, and people would travel to Melbourne especially to ring here. In fact, in 1973, some locals and some other Australian women travelled to Melbourne, and we had the first all-female tower bell. That was a front 8, not on 12, but it was first all-female tower bell in 1973 in Australia. It was young here, so it's got quite a strong history. It's currently a little bit weak in the ringing scene, but we are still ringing at most of these towers. I think it'll probably be more interesting to move on to New South Wales, but I'll pause in case there's comments or questions about the Victorian ringing.
No, it's no specific questions there, but yeah, I'm very lucky to have been out to Australia a couple of times and have rung at St Paul's. So that's the only tower I've rung at in Australia.
Oh, well, that's not one of the ones I count as challenging, even though
No,
it has a long draft and what have you, but it now has rope guides that make it a lot easier than it used to be. Yeah. So
yeah,
you missed some of our challenging ones. Next time, come and get the ones that are a bit more story behind them.
yeah, absolutely,
It's got
yes.
the history, though. It's got the history.
Yeah, only a flying visit, but anyway, yeah, should we carry on?
Yes.
Perfect, thanks.
So I'm going to move up to Sydney. Both Sydney and Melbourne have about 5 million people. They are each large cities. Sydney has 18 towers compared to Melbourne's 5. They're spread out, 13 of them within 1 hour drive of each other. All of them, I think, very ringable. None of them that I'd say have that, it's like they're calling out for being rehung or retuned. I think that's correct. There's 2 12s. They were augmented to 12 in 1986 and 1989. That's the Anglican and Catholic cathedrals in Sydney. So again, I've already given that away, recent, the 12s. Currently the main centre of Australian ringing. I don't think there'll be any argument about that. And I was reflecting in my mind, and I must admit I haven't actually asked anyone's opinion, but you can put comments in the Q&A. I think probably having some strong ringers in Sydney encouraged the augmentation to 12, and then there's just enough ringers and enough strong ringers to actually get that positive feedback and keep improving and strengthening the ringing. Up until 2003, there were 10 towers. So we've had 8 towers going in the last 17 years. So it's still very lively, whole of Australia really, very lively for putting in new towers. I'd have to count St Mary's Cathedral as my favourite tower. It wasn't my main tower, it wasn't my home tower when I lived in Sydney. I learnt in Sydney. I lived in Adelaide and Melbourne, went back to Sydney, had another 10 years there. Now I'm back in Melbourne. And it was never my home tower, but just a balance of ease to ring and nice sound, easy to hear sound and good sound and ease of ringing, balancing all those things up. I would have to count St Mary's as my favourite, but as I said, I never made it my home tower, but I was always welcome there, which was great. Lots of towers, lots of bands, good cooperation between them, but it's not a single coherent band or anything like that. What I was very impressed in Sydney is there was a lot of ringers who were very prepared to travel and help other towers. It's very supportive in that way. Not even just within Sydney or within New South Wales. I ran a weekend of ringing here 2 or 3 weeks ago, and a couple of Sydney ringers came down to help strengthen the band for that, which was great. So it's about 1 hour flight down or a full day's driving. Heat in Adelaide, I told you, was like a furnace. Heat in Sydney is like a sauna. It's got beautiful winters. The winters are the good ringing time. The summer, it's got an average temperature of about 26 degree maximum, so it's not extraordinarily hot. It can have its really hot days, but typically, especially these ones that are a bit closer to the ocean, not hot, but very, very humid. So this one I'd say is like ringing in a sauna. You still need your ice bottle, you still need your fans. Towers have gradually been putting in air conditioning. I don't think St Mary's has air conditioning yet, but there are quite a few towers that have put it in recently. You still get pretty sweaty. In Sydney, sweaty means doing nothing, you get sweaty just because the humidity is so high. So it's quite different to Adelaide with the dry heat where So a bit of exercise makes you sweaty. Here, just standing up makes you sweaty. So again, yeah, well, bell ringers, if you're going out for dinner, you'd usually go and try and fit in a shower and a change of clothes between times. But the winters are glorious. Winters in Sydney, fantastic, and Brisbane as you go further north. What else to say about Sydney? I'm going to talk about New South Wales. I'll just tell you about the pictures I've got here. And so you can see we've got quite a few towers central and close to each other, and then up to 18 if you include the suburbs. So we've got St Mary's Cathedral on the left this was, I think, one of the first practices they got back to after the COVID lockdown. They were able to ring through most of last year. It was Victoria, Melbourne had the really strongest lockdown for the longest time, but it was much shorter lockdown in Sydney, and they were able to ring. So that's just before, I think, maybe just after one of their practices. Climb up the tower, across the roof into the main tower where you ring. Get views across Sydney Harbour, absolutely beautiful. Just go there for the tourist thing, even if you don't want to ring. And the bottom right-hand one is inside at St Mary's Cathedral. Very spacious tower, 12 bells plus 2 accidentals, so really good flexibility for which bells you're ringing. I think it's 2, certainly 1, maybe I forget now, sorry. That picture is from my most recent visit to Sydney, where I was supporting a weekend they organised, but everyone else was local to Sydney or New South Wales, probably only within a couple of hours drive. And that was especially celebrating women in ringing. So if it looks like a lot of women, it's because it was. We had that photo was from our Saturday morning practice, which was fantastic. I didn't need nerves of steel because of the COVID restrictions. We've had restrictions between the different states at different times when there's a flare-up of COVID cases in one state and not the other. They say, that's it, we don't want Victorians visiting New South Wales. And it was a bit touch and go for my visit, but I had a great weekend there. So that was lovely. Catching up with people. Questions and comments before I move to the rest of New South Wales?
Good. Yeah, I've just Google is my constant companion. Yes, you're right. This is two accidentals at St Mary's.
Yes.
To give you, yeah, it's got the flat sticks for the light, middle 8, and then the extra treble, which gives you a
light 10.
Yeah, a light 10 or
and a light 10 as well.
Yeah, that's great. So I did have a question, but it has temporarily evaporated out of my head. Yeah, we'll come back.
Okay, I'll tell you that the original 8 at St Mary's Cathedral, 7 of them were sent to, as they've got an arrangement, to form the basis of the 12 in Adelaide. So the Catholic Cathedral in Adelaide has the 12, and 7 of those bells came from the Catholic Cathedral in Sydney when they replaced them with this new 12, which are beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Yeah, let's
move on.
Let's move on to the rest of the towers. Yeah,
okay.
I think that'd be good.
So we had 10 new towers in Sydney in the last 17 or 18 years. New South Wales and ACT, Canberra's in the Australian Capital Territory. That's a branch in itself. So in addition to the 18 towers within Sydney, there's 13 towers outside Sydney, and only 2 of those prior to 1987. So, and they were, 2 that were there from 1870 to 1987, so it's 2 very historic ones, but 11 new towers since 1987. So as I said, a lot of growth. These ones, Sydney and outside Sydney, not all of them, but a huge number of them, thanks to Ron Shepherd, is very enthusiastic at looking for opportunities and facilitating and doing a lot of the practical work as well to install them. Towers outside Sydney, a lot of these are quite remote, and varying strengths of bands and varying, whether they've actually able to ring regularly or they rely on a couple of visitors. And I guess they go up and down. I've quite a long list of talking points I'll go through. So there's quite a varied climate across Australia and even within New South Wales, and from summer to winter. So the picture on the bottom right there is from Canberra. It's a very light ring of 8. We've got some very good quality ringers there, including the one on the right, Julie Doyle, who had learnt as a youngster, I think, in the UK. I didn't ring for many years, and she lived in Canberra, and the bells got installed, and she's back ringing as a key member of the band there. She was been president of ANZAB as well since she got back to ringing. Now, what I find interesting about that photo is the masks. So we've been ringing in masks a bit this year due to COVID, but this was from January, and they were ringing in masks because of the thick bushfire smoke. We had horrendous bushfires we're talking 14 months ago now, and Canberra had dreadful air quality. And I think this photo, they had a story behind this. It was the previous day, it was 44 degrees, and they were ringing for a wedding, so they rang anyway. And they're light bells, but 44 degrees, that's horrible. It's above body temperature. It's hard work. Lots of water. They rang, and then the smoke was so bad they had to ring in masks as well. So pretty unpleasant ringing conditions. The picture with all the scaffolding on it, that's from Bathurst, which is a few hours drive west of Sydney. It's another new tower, old church, new tower, modern tower. And I got to ring there a couple of early rings, including it was so early that they hadn't finished putting on the windows or walls. So you climbed up through the scaffolding. We'd taken along some ropes. We rang the bells. We had quite a good audience in the park watching us. It's been a nicely designed tower in the sense that people in the park or the street can look up and see you ringing through the big glass windows, and they can, not a great view, but they can see to some extent the bells turning over as well. But it was quite fun climbing up through the scaffolding and then ringing when there was nothing to stop, at floor level, at the windows of floor to ceiling. And there you are, big, into the open air and so on. Very noisy. That was very noisy before they finished the windows and walls. I've got a picture of Wagga, which is the 8 just above the photo of the church tower there, the spire. That was my coldest Court Appeal. In fact, maybe my only cold Court Appeal in Australia. Mostly you ring in T-shirts. In winter, in Sydney, Melbourne even, you might wear a cotton long sleeve jumper, unlikely to actually want anything that's really warm, like a woolen jumper. But in Wagga in winter, they had a heater, but it was a bar heater that was not very comfortable to ring under, and it was the walls had got really cold, and even at the end of the Court Appeal, I think I rang that Court Appeal in a beanie. It was very cold. The tower Orange is about 3 hours drive from Western Sydney, 4 hours drive maybe from Sydney. We had a striking competition at Parramatta, suburban Sydney, and the Orange bell ringers were enthusiastic enough, and they still have a really good band, a very coherent, enthusiastic band. I helped train some of them, which was nice. They drove 3 hours to be part of the striking competition. We had a judge. If you're visiting from the UK and you're a reasonable ringer, you may well get tapped on the shoulder and asked to judge a local striking competition. We had one of those. We had a woman from England visiting, judging the striking competition. She said, I'm going to go back and tell my towers in my association that say, I can't really be bothered. It's going to be a half-hour drive to come to a striking competition or an association event. I'm going to tell them. in Australia, they're keen enough, they'll drive 3 hours to be part of it. So that, yeah, very coherent and strong band there. So I'll tell you a bit about local customs with these isolated towers. And Armadale is the most isolated single tower in Australia, about 4 hours drive from its nearest neighbour and further to a strong ringing centre. And when I'm thinking local customs, I'm not thinking Armadale. So there's some towers you go along and you catch hold and then no one says anything, and then you find out that the local custom is that the treble is always the conductor, and if as a local you've caught hold of the treble, they assume you will know that you're going to be the conductor. So that's the sort of thing that, you know, can happen, especially in isolated towers where they maybe don't do a lot of visiting or get a lot of visitors. But at that particular tower, a very friendly group, give you a fantastic lunch if you take a band up there to help work with them, make you very welcome. Another local custom, not one of these towers, and changed now, but there used to be a tower in Australia where they'd put out the music stands and they'd have the changes written out, and you'd ring one change and you'd keep ringing it. Apparently, I never rang there till the conductor said next change, and then you'd all move on to the next change that was written out on the music stand. But I think that has become a bit more mainstream ringing now. Very impressed when I was in Sydney, and I was part of it, but it was quite fun. We'd go for a weekend away to go specifically and support these bell towers. So it was about a 7-hour drive to Griffith, not quite so far to Armadale, but almost, you know, good, most of a day drive, make a two-night weekend of it, and go and support these towers, maybe getting a few of their locals through a quarter peal, or in Armadale, there's a core band that are quite good, so there's a few extras and you can ring Stedman triples or Cambridge major. Some of them, they don't have a local ringer who's competent to teach handling, so you go and do some teaching of handling to try and build up the band. We've got a few experienced ringers who, as in we've got Jim Wolford, who used to ring at York Minster and then was a key ringer in Sydney for many years, very good ringer, who moved to Orange after it was already quite a strong and coherent band, but has further strengthened it by living there. Christopher O'Mahony, who learnt in Sydney, but lived in the UK for many years. You'd know him as a recent president of the Central Council. Lives in Bathurst, which is that 112 outside Sydney, the 112 outside a capital city. He lives there now, so he's helping strengthen that band. I believe the bells are put in Armadale. There's already a ringer there who lived there, who'd learnt it. Well, actually, I think she learnt in Sydney. So I think if Simon's online, he can tell me. So that sort of helped strengthen that band. So we've got a few strong, experienced ringers who've moved out of Sydney. Bowral, the bells went in there. There was already a ringer who lived there who'd learnt in Sydney, who's quite a good ringer and good teacher, was able to help strengthen and build that band. Oh, and in Canberra, of course, as I mentioned, ringers who are already good ringers who are living there. The bells went in, and then that's helped give the band a kickstart. I think that's all the talking points I had on New South Wales, which was pretty much going to bring me towards the end of the tour of towers. So I think I've got a couple more slides. How are we going on time there?
Yeah, we're doing
any
okay.
Questions?
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions, but I think they're mainly
Comments?
about other bits and bobs. So if we go on,
I'll finish it off, and then we'll come back to any further questions.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay. So I thought, I was told it would be interesting just briefly about the COVID-19 situation. So apart from that, I can sort of feel good that I'm back ringing now. A lot of this, I think, is maybe more similar to the UK, except briefer. So what's different? So we we did have, especially in Melbourne, quite an extended lockdown. We got online, so I got myself some e-bells. I did some online ringing, which was good because I was able to learn different things. But the ping times here are slower, especially when we're working with a UK server, really slow response times. I was doing some work online with a couple of Australian ringers and UK ringer, so we found that the Singapore server for ringing room was a good compromise, where we had, we all had poor but no ping times, but it was a good compromise. We took up the handbills in the winter during the lockdown, and eventually we were able to meet in person and ring in the park and then ring in houses. And now I think I'm only allowed 15 visitors, but in my personal house, but that it doesn't feel much of a restriction anymore. As of this month, we have about 80% of our towers are back ringing, and a couple more just about to start. Depends, you negotiate with your local authorities regarding, as well as the government restrictions regarding whether you can ring. We went back ringing. We wore masks for a while. Now we don't even have to wear masks. So the bottom left-hand picture is St Paul's Cathedral, Melbourne. We had restriction on numbers, we have to wear masks. That's eased recently. The middle picture at the bottom is the tower I learnt in, and I sort of still feel strong affinity to in Sydney from a few weeks ago when I was there. And I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about that. We've got the left-hand guy learnt in the UK and has recently taken up ringing again in Australia. Kinman and Kay, the next two, they're married to each other. They learnt locally, largely taught by me. Priscilla, local, largely taught by me. And Bev, local, not taught by me, but she sort of one of her mentors. So it's quite a, it's quite a personal to me band photo, that one. Kinman, born in Singapore, but moved to Australia for university, essentially. Kay, I'm just going left to right. So Sam, UK. Kinman, born in Singapore, moved to Australia as a young adult. Kay, born in Outback Australia, I believe, brought up in Outback Australia, so several generations. Priscilla, I think like me, moved to Australia as a child. Families from Hong Kong. And then Bev to my right, Bev on the far right, she's multi-generational Australian, Chinese background, you can tell by the look there, but multi-generation Australian. Oh, and then the right-hand picture is just showing off, it's not my band. I was definitely not in this. I'm not a Spliced Surprise Royal 14 method, but we've had two of those in Sydney at St Mary's Cathedral this year, and they may be the only two tower bells rung so far this year, I'm not sure, and the world, and there they are. So we have a very strong band. I think that band is one from Goulburn, a few hours out of Sydney, and one from Adelaide, and then 8 from Sydney. It's a very strong band. So, and we've taken up, of course, the online meetings, and that's actually been a positive thing, especially with these distances, that we're getting more into the online meetings and allowing people to participate in meetings that they would otherwise have had to travel 7 hours driving or just skip, and therefore usually skip. So I think I'll, from there, just remind you that once we open our borders again, you're very welcome. You don't need to be a surprise major ringer to be made welcome. If you can safely handle a bell, you'll be made welcome in any tower in Australia. And we've got the tower directory on our website, which will allow you to find all the contacts you need and information. I think that's where I was going to stop. Over to you, David.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that indeed. That's been really good. And I'm sure that most of the people on tonight's webinar have probably not even really thought about towers in Australia. And so it's really good to have like a comprehensive tour Yeah, and I think, yeah, certainly at this time of year, I think we all dream of feeling warm in a bell tower.
Yes.
We're still in the sort of cold and soggy bit of the end of winter here. So no, it's really great. I think the questions that people have are mostly around sort of recruitment and sort of maintaining momentum. So in general, would you find it easy to recruit ringers in Australia?
I think that's something we struggle with, and I think struggle with as I think that would probably be a common thing, Australia and elsewhere. We have good numbers, and I think a lot of where we have the good numbers is thanks to the new towers, which has developed a lot of enthusiasm. As soon as you put in a new tower, it sort of opens up a whole new group. And some of the new towers we've put in, we instantly get, not instantly, there's a lot of work there, but the initial band, you might get 12 or 15 people that form the initial band and then stay as a very strong cohesive band for quite a long time. And then they get to the point, maybe 5 or 10 years in, where they have to think of succession planning. We must make sure we're not too exclusive and that we actually put that effort into getting new members. But the new bell tower of itself can create quite a lot of enthusiasm. And I think, we've got a lot of towers that have, just 1 or 2 people attached to that particular church, where there is bell ringers a little, making use of these beautiful facilities. And then we have quite a few towers, especially the new towers, where they've actually done a lot of recruitment from the local congregation, and they have quite a strong, most of the ringers actually tied to the church. And yeah, they do get to the point where it becomes a bit of a problem. They have to refresh that and regenerate the group.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That obviously, it's great that you went through and of course, having labels on things saying it's 7 hours between these 2 adjacent points. I suspect that we probably still don't really have the concept of what that's like.
And then I said Sydney ringers have been fantastic. The new tower goes in, and 2 or 3 Sydney ringers might go up and even spend a week or 2 weeks there at a time training up the new ringers so that they can walk away knowing that they've got a core band who can actually ring safely. And then we have these follow-up visits to actually help keep developing them. And then we organise ringing schools in Sydney where we bring in ringers from the country towers to Sydney for a weekend of concentrated training as well.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think I suppose the question then leads on to do you try and organise a programme of people? So for example, you mentioned striking competitions. Is there sort of like an organised routine where you visit places so that everyone gets a go, or is it just much more organic than that?
You mean a go as hosting the striking competition?
Yeah, sorry, as in.
So we have, on the Australian and New Zealand Association, we have our AGMs and festivals once a year, which is fantastic. You get an association with about 500 members will get about 100 turning up for a festival once a year, and that rotates largely between the major centres, but occasionally to the country centres, and New Zealand is take their turns in hosting it. But then more from a training point of view within New South Wales, they run 2 striking competitions that I'd call traditional ones that are hosted by towers within the Sydney area typically. I think I've only been to one that was outside the Sydney area, so a 6-bell and then 6 months later an 8-bell striking competition. And then and the country towers are welcome to come along, but more typically, Orange did one year. More typically it's the Sydney towers. Then we have recently, thanks to Ron Shepherd, as enthusiasm, started up a recorded 6-bell and 8-bell competition where the country towers ring on their own bells, record it and send it in. And participate that way. And we've also had on the Australia and New Zealand scale recorded 10 and 12 bell, where you record it on your local tower and send it in.
That's really interesting.
On that as well.
A slight diversion potentially. Yep. How many of the Australian towers would you say are using ringing room, and do you think that it's likely to persist after COVID's long gone? Because as you mentioned, it is one way of having a group event where everyone's ringing live together, potentially not with their normal band, maybe trying something different, but don't have these enormous distances to cover. I mean, I think you mentioned the drawbacks of ringing room, but do you think it has?
Well, this week we got an Australian server for ringing room. So excellent. That will be good for Australian and New Zealand ringers. But if we want to ring with the UK ringers, you would get a huge lag when you're using the Australian server. So I think Australian to the UK ringers ringing together is still going to be quite challenging, but within Australia, it's okay. So I wouldn't say there's been a huge uptake on the ringing room, and maybe partly because apart from Melbourne, it hasn't been a very big lockdown. New Zealand, it was a matter of a month or a couple of months, maybe. It wasn't a very long lockdown. And a lot of Perth, they didn't have much of a lockdown. Sydney, they're up and ringing again. However, I know that New Zealand ringers they've taken on to ringing room in spite of Wellington, New Zealand, they've taken it up, even though they've not had big lockdowns themselves. Brisbane ringers have made it a regular thing. I know that in Adelaide they set up, I'm not sure about the ringing room use, someone else might be able to comment, but they set up online, like you have here with your series of talks, they set up online weekly theory lessons. They've got some very good ringers when they're talking about the theory of ringing, so they set it up that way. I've found for myself, ringing room, controlling a single bell just didn't capture my interest. I'm prepared to do it just to be sociable and help others, but doing the two bells and getting the e-bells even better, building up the handbell skills, that did capture my interest, and I expect I'll continue doing that as a way of building up my handbell ringing skills. That's about all I know about that on that. Yeah.
That's good. We've got a couple of points in from Stephen Burr, who's the president of the local district here, and he notes that he achieved many ringing firsts when he was in Australia 18 years ago. Was invited to stay several days to ringer's house and even found a temporary job in Melbourne through a local ringer. So can definitely vouch for the friendly and welcoming atmosphere. He then goes on to say, do you know what? It turns out I've rung a quarter with Darren.
Excellent.
And has shared this, let's just tick a few boxes, and has shared this for us to have a look at. So a little bit of a while back now, but yes, it was it also sort of links into my experience in Australia that Andrew Chin welcomed me when I visited in 2007.
Excellent. Yes, I was living in Melbourne then, and then I went to Sydney in 2006, and now I'm back in Melbourne. Excellent. Thanks, Stephen.
So there we go. Obviously across the other side of the world, but it's a small world, as it turns out. So that's great. So we're getting towards the end of the questions, but maybe the final one comes back to recruitment again. And what do you find about the age profile? And in particular, would you say that you have young ringers taking up the hobby?
We do have young ringers taking up the hobby. Again, it varies quite a bit from tower to tower and area to area. So in Perth, we have a lot of young ringers. In Adelaide, I think we have young ringers, quite a few young ringers at the moment. In Sydney, there were some towers where I was the youth group, which I learnt to ring in about 1990. So gives you an idea of what, you can see me anyway, what youth is. But the other towers that were a lot younger, a younger group. So overall, the profile's not too bad, but there's some towers where felt that was probably a bit on the old side, and we needed to keep encouraging the younger ones. But as you would know, people are ringing well into their 90s, so that's the good news. We've got quite a few ringers in Australia that's very strong in their 80s and still ringing in their 90s, maybe not quite so strong. I think Tom Goodyear rang a peal soon after he turned 90 and was quite pleased that he was able to do that. And yeah, it's a bit of a mix. Yeah. We'd like more ringers. We'd like more young ringers. Guess what? Same all around the world, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. That's something that we can all certainly say that we have in common.
Armidale, who's my co-webmaster, is based in Armidale. That's a tower that's 4 hours drive from its nearest neighbour. That's a bit of a university town. It's not very large, but it's a university town, and they've trained quite a lot of young, I'm not talking 10-year-olds, I'm talking 20-year-olds. And some of those other cities get the benefit. We've got one in Melbourne now who is trained in Armidale very nicely, and we're delighted to have her here. But they do feel they've trained a few people that they've then gone off and left Armidale and ended up hopefully continuing to ring elsewhere.
That's right. I mean, the one of the towers that I ring at regularly, we have quite a strong youth contingent. In fact, we're primarily a youth band, as in under 16s, and yeah, you kind of do it in the knowledge that they're going to disappear, and that you actually hope that's the way to bring the exercise to new places or rejuvenate it elsewhere.
If they can learn quickly and they bring in all that enthusiasm, it's still great fun at the time, even though you do know they're going to move on.
Yep, so absolutely.
They may end up ringing in Australia. Fantastic. Keep training them up and send them out here.
Yeah, I'm sure that several of them would welcome a trip to Australia right now. So
I don't mean welcome. They can come and live here. We'll have them.
Brilliant. Well, I think we have got to the end of the questions. I mean, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for giving up your time this morning, and again for the practice session that we had last week. It's really greatly appreciated. The technology has worked, which I'm also very thankful for. It's been really good, and yeah, so I hope that you'll see some representatives from the UK and maybe the Ely Darcen Association with you in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
Yeah, just sort of remains for me to say we do have another webinar next week, which is going to be Roger Booth speaking on the role of mini rings in the effort to recover. So just to fill in, obviously we're going to be able to meet outdoors from the end of this month here. Yeah, mini rings could have a part to play because it could still be quite a few months until we're able to meet in person indoors. Final comment there from Sue Ellis says, thanks Darren, really great presentation, really enjoyed it, thanks a lot.
My pleasure, always nice to talk to about ringing and to ringers.
Brilliant. All right.